Hello, my name is Alan Benjamin. I'm a guitarist and multi-instrumentalist from the band Advent. I'm here in New Jersey to speak with you today about recording an electric guitar or bass directly, that is, without the use of an amplifier. First, I'd like to begin by discussing the key advantages and disadvantages of this approach. Among the key advantages are the fact that you don't need an amp in the first place. Also, since you're going direct, you can record the sound of your pickups right onto a track and then process it later, which gives you a lot of flexibility. The other thing that I like about this approach is that it minimizes background noise, especially for heavily overdriven guitars or sounds where you need to really crank and amp up and you get a lot of background noise. Now on the disadvantage column, you'll see that we do have to make sure that we're plugging our instrument into an input that has the correct impedance, or else you're not going to get a very good transfer of that sound out of your instrument. It's also a little bit more difficult to get organic sounds, I find, when you record those clean sounds from your pickups directly and then have to process it later, and we'll discuss that in more detail too. Now I'd briefly like to share some of the characteristics of electric guitar and bass pickups and their outputs. I've listed information here for you, but I think the most important thing to note is the input impedance of the device you're plugging that instrument directly into. If you're plugging directly into an audio interface in particular, you want to look for something that's designed for guitar or bass, and typically that will involve having input impedance in the 220K to about 1 megohm range. Now that we know a bit more about what we'd like to plug our instrument into, let's take a look at the various audio interface input options that are available. I've created a chart here, and what you'll notice is I've color-coded it in a green, yellow, red fashion to indicate green being the easiest, yellow being you can probably do this with a little bit of help, and red being probably not. Now, the easiest and most direct approach is if you have an audio interface that has at least one input that's designed for a guitar or bass. If you don't have an interface with that capability and you only have balanced inputs or XLR inputs, mic inputs in my case, and you can use a DI box. Now let's look at some of the basic connectivity methodologies based on what we just discussed. Remember, the easiest thing is to just take your guitar and plug it into an audio interface that has an input that's designed explicitly for guitar or bass. The next most common option is to use a DI box. So I'll take the output from my guitar cable, plug it into the input of my DI box. I will take the female end of my XLR cable, plug it into the output of the DI box, and then take the male end of my XLR cable and plug it into one of the mic inputs on my audio interface. And the last basic option is an amp simulator or modeler. One example might be a Johnson J station like I have here. You'll note in this example you have stereo analog outputs that would go to line inputs on your audio interface, or if you prefer, there's even a SPDIF, and you can connect digitally. Now that we're connected, let's set our input levels. I provided some basic guidance here. The most important thing is to keep your peaks below -6 dB full scale if you're recording 24-bit. You may also want to check your guitar or bass amp simulation software and just make sure your input is driving the tone that you like. You can try pushing it a little bit if necessary, but never let your peaks exceed 0 dB. Now that we've plugged in and set our levels, let's talk briefly about monitoring. The biggest concern here is latency. You see, the signal has to go into your audio interface, get processed by your DAW software, and then presented on the output of your audio interface again, and that takes time. With proper tuning, however, you can usually get that down to a pretty acceptable level. And in the cases where you still want to hear something more immediate, some interfaces offer what's called a zero latency monitoring feature. The last topic I'd like to discuss is the choice of recording your dry direct pickup sound, processing that in some form and recording those results, or possibly doing both. It's a fairly complicated subject, but I've outlined some of the key differences in this slide, and I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. If you have any questions, though, please feel free to send me an email, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation, and happy tracking.